Adaptation is and always has been one of the most prominent forms of creative expression. While large vocal swaths of the internet reliably decry every announcement of a movie sequel or remake, citing a perceived dearth of originality in Hollywood, the fact remains that we, as humans, have been retelling stories since the dawn of our existence. From the oral tradition of folklore and mythology to the massive film franchises that dominate the box office, a common thread exists illustrating our predilection to conform familiar tales to contemporary sensibilities. But is there some inherent responsibility among creatives to stay true to their source? And how is this accomplished? There's no metric for this kind of authorial success, an admittedly nebulous concept that often boils down to, you know it when you see it. So today, we'll be taking a look at a game that serves as a sequel to a film that was itself a remake of a movie based on a novella, and asking ourselves, how does this thing maintain the spirit of its forebears in a whole new medium? Let's find out. John W. Campbell is not a name frequently heard when discussing the titans of science fiction, but as an editor of some of the most well-respected writers in the genre, he could arguably be credited with shaping the careers of stalwarts such as Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert Heinlein. Asimov once even referred to Campbell as the most powerful force in science fiction ever. Though history has shown his personal politics were as unsavory as genre contemporaries H.P. Lovecraft and the aforementioned Heinlein and Asimov, there's no denying the impact he had on pulp literature of the time. Campbell was also a writer in his own right, but unless you're already familiar with his career, I think you'd be hard-pressed to name any of his works, save for maybe one. The August 1938 edition of Astounding Science Fiction magazine saw the publication of the first part of Campbell's story, Who Goes There? The novella follows a group of scientific researchers based in Antarctica who discover a crashed alien spacecraft and its frozen otherworldly pilot. The extraterrestrial survives the thawing process and begins to kill the humans, taking on their forms as identical copies. This foments distrust among the men, making them question the identities of all among their ranks. But to conquer this enemy, they must first defeat the paranoia that may even pose more of a threat than the rampaging monster. The story was a hit. Fellow sci-fi author A.E. Van Vogt declared the work the best horror tale in science fiction. And in 1973, it was chosen by the prestigious Science Fiction Writers of America Guild as one of the most influential, important, and memorable sci-fi stories that has ever been written. More than a decade after its initial publication, filmmaker Howard Hawks' production company, Winchester Pictures Corporation, picked up Who Goes There for a film version. The novella was loosely adapted by Charles Lederer, writer on such notable films as Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and The Spirit of St. Louis, with uncredited input from Hawks and screenwriter Ben Hecht. Although the director credit went to Christian Nyby, some debate still exists around whether Hawks actually directed the picture, much like the question surrounding Steven Spielberg's involvement in Tobe Hooper's 1982 film Poltergeist. Retitled as The Thing from Another World, the film hit U.S. movie houses on April 27, 1951, taking the premise and setting of Campbell's tale and creating something of a bog-standard creature feature for the era. The shape-shifting alien was changed to a blood-drinking humanoid monster made of plant matter. One of the characters even refers to this entity as a super carrot, which doesn't sound particularly scary to me.
It sounds like, well, just as though you're describing some form of super carrot. That's nearly right, Mr. Scott.
With the reimagining of the antagonist came the stripping of the central themes of Campbell's story, namely the distrust and paranoia among the human besieged. The film instead opts for a far more politically conservative message, upholding a skepticism of science and a jingoistic celebration of military proactivity. Some have even read McCarthyist subtext in the story, claiming to see anti-communist ideas in the narrative. The film is notable for its snappy dialogue and likable characters, and a remarkable firebombing sequence that feels legitimately dangerous. But as an adaptation of Campbell's novella, I feel it falls relatively far from the tree. Then in the mid-1970s, interest in a new film version of Who Goes There began growing. Universal Pictures acquired the rights and pursued several writers and directors to develop the project. Tobe Hooper was attached for a time before producers became dissatisfied with his work, and an American Werewolf in London director John Landis was also approached but was unable to be brought on board. Enter John Carpenter, an independent filmmaker who had cemented himself in horror cinema with his films Halloween and The Fog. Carpenter was already a fan of The Thing from Another World, having paid homage to it in his seminal 1978 slasher, but was hesitant to take on this effort for a number of reasons.
I felt at first it might be a mistake to try to remake any film. But then on thinking about it, what a challenge.
Carpenter had never worked with a major studio before and feared the oversight would inhibit his creative control, but his trepidation primarily came from the fact that he didn't want to make a redundant rehash of one of his favorite films without bringing something fresh to the table.
When they offered me the remake of The Thing, rather than remaking the original film, I thought I'd go back to the short story, which I felt was never done, and do something really entirely different.
So with the help of screenwriter Bill Lancaster, who had made a name for himself with the financially and critically successful The Bad News Bears in 1976, the script took form as a much closer adaptation of Campbell's original novella than Hawks and Knivy's film. Working closely with Carpenter, Lancaster crafted a story that both maintained the original tone and subtext of its source and updated it for modern audiences, paring down a whopping 37-character roster to a tight 12-man ensemble and injecting the narrative with some much-needed action beats. The final product ultimately combined the claustrophobia of a chamber thriller with the gruesome phantasmagoria of recent films such as Ridley Scott's Alien. Recruiting such actors as Kurt Russell, whom Carpenter had already worked with on the made-for-TV biopic Elvis and Escape from New York, a then unknown Wilford Brimley, and Keith David in his first film role, the cast began to take shape. Legendary spaghetti western composer Ennio Morricone was brought on to score the film, as well as a young makeup effects artist named Rob Bottin, who had worked with Carpenter previously on The Fog. Film exteriors were shot in the frigid cold of Alaska and British Columbia, while refrigerated sets were built in Los Angeles so that the actor's breath could be seen in some indoor locations. And on June 25, 1982, The Thing was unleashed on American audiences. Like Campbell's Who Goes There and the 1951 movie version, the film follows a group of scientists in Antarctica who are forced to contend with an aggressive alien life form threatening to eradicate them all. After a troubling encounter with a scientist from a nearby Norwegian camp, the crew of Outpost 31 investigates, discovering the grisly remains of the Scandinavians at their facility. The only survivor of this nasty, mysterious incident is a sled dog whom the Americans take into their kennel. Soon it is revealed that the danger has followed them home as the dog transforms and begins to assimilate another canine in uniquely grotesque fashion. The team determines that this creature, whatever it is, has the ability to absorb and perfectly replicate other life forms, and a trip to a nearby excavation site uncovers what appears to be a large spacecraft, meaning this thing is likely not of this Earth. Suspicion and dubiety soon set in, pitting the men against each other and complicating their struggle to survive. Suspected infected are quarantined, blood tests are administered, and accusations thrown as one by one the scientists fall to an enemy hidden in plain sight. The film ends as Kurt Russell's MacReady and Keith David's Childs share a bittersweet moment of equal parts mistrust and resolve, agreeing that the best thing they can do is die in the cold as their destroyed base burns all around them. It's the only way to be sure the thing never reaches the mainland. Audiences and critics hated it. Alan Spencer of Starlog said that Carpenter totally ruined the remake, and Cinefantastique proposed that the titular Thing was perhaps the most unloved monster in movie history. Having come off the comparably light-hearted and optimistic portrayal of an alien visitor in Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which had come out just 2 weeks prior, moviegoers did not take to the horrific sights or nihilistic tone of Carpenter's first studio effort. But on home video, a cult following emerged, and over the years the dominating opinion on the film completely changed. What was once described by Vincent Canby of the New York Times as instant junk is now not only considered a classic of science fiction cinema, but also one of the greatest horror movies of all time. Hailed as a premier showcase of practical makeup effects even to this day, fans of the film are taken not only with Bottin's twisted creations, but also the downbeat atmosphere, Dean Cundy's beautiful cinematography, and Morricone's moody, if sparse, score. But one of the most celebrated aspects of the movie is its ambiguous ending, begging the questions: who was the thing? Was it Childs or MacReady? What if both, or maybe neither? And what happened after the credits rolled? In the early 2000s, it seems that Vivendi Universal was asking those same questions. Looking through their parent studio's catalog of films that could be adapted as video games, they landed on John Carpenter's The Thing. Working with Konami as co-publishers, Vivendi invited Computer Artworks to develop a proof of concept for what would serve as an interactive sequel to the 1982 film. British computer artist William Latham was tapped by the studio to direct the game, and if you've ever seen his work, it's easy to see why. Latham and his team set about creating a single level's worth of gameplay, complete with a boss encounter at the end. The demo was based on the engine made for their 2000 third-person action game EVOLVA for Windows machines. The publisher was impressed and passed the reins to Latham along with a huge amount of creative control.
They told us to come up with original ideas. There weren't strict guidelines as long as we retained the quality of the original work.
Computer Artworks began work on the game in November of 2000, implementing squad-based mechanics along with a unique system that had your teammates reacting to stressful situations and unsightly environments. Maintaining trust with your cohort was a focal point, as well as a possibility that characters could snap under pressure or even become infected themselves.
It was early days for squad-based games, and the fear, trust, and infection mechanic was quite innovative for the time. It came from very early meetings where we all watched the film to come up with brand identifiers. We decided there should be a novel AI element that mimicked what happened within the film. You never know who's going to turn.
After nearly 2 years in development, The Thing was released for Sony PlayStation 2, Microsoft Xbox, and PC in late summer 2002. Today, we'll be focusing on the PS2 version. Taking place 3 months after the events of the film, the player takes control of Captain J.F. Blake, a Special Forces officer who has been recruited to lead Bravo team on an investigation of Outpost 31. Upon arrival, Blake discovers the smoldering remains of the facility, along with evidence that describes the alien entity who laid waste to this team of researchers. Here, the player can explore familiar locations from the film, including the Rec Room, MacReady's shack, and the smaller spacecraft being made by Wilford Brimley's Blair, while under the influence of the Thing. Blake also finds the remains of Childs, who has died of hypothermia. But the only thing that remains of MacReady is the tape we witness him record in the movie.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished. If none of us make it, at least there'll be some kind of a record.
Storm's been hitting us hard now for 48 hours. We still have nothing to go on.
By order of Colonel Whitley communicating by radio, Bravo team set C4 explosives to destroy what remains of Outpost 31. They then head to the Norwegian camp to look for Alpha Team, another Special Forces group investigating these incidents with whom they have lost contact. There, Blake finds Pierce, the leader of Alpha Team, and must prove to him that he is not infected by way of blood test. They soon get separated, and as Blake tries to re-establish communication with Whitley, finds the radio at the Norwegian camp has been stolen. Blake eventually reunites with Pierce, who has become infected and chooses to kill himself to avoid the inevitable transformation. The player then tracks down the radio thief, who has mutated and must be destroyed. The player then gains access to an underground facility where Blake learns of a company called Gen Inc., who is performing experiments on those infected by the Thing. The research team became victims of the alien, leaving only a few scientists alive, including the head of the project, Dr. Sean Faraday, featuring an uncredited voice cameo by director John Carpenter.
Dr. Faraday, I presume.
I don't think we've got time for formal introductions. Can you get us out of here?
The director's involvement is perhaps unsurprising, as he's been a long-time vocal fan of video games. Faraday even looks a bit like Carpenter, don't you think? Blake and Faraday encounter Whitley as they attempt to escape the laboratory. The Colonel has Blake tranquilized and reveals to Faraday that he has injected himself with the alien gene, proving that it can be controlled. Whitley then kills Faraday. Blake awakes to find himself in a medical bay where he finds out he has a special immunity to the infection. He also discovers that Gen Inc. was experimenting with a man-made variation of the disease to use in biological warfare. This so-called cloud virus was injected by Whitley in an attempt to cure his cancer. Realizing that Whitley has gone mad and intends to distribute the virus worldwide, Blake takes it upon himself to escape the medical lab, destroy the planes carrying the biological weapon, and confront Whitley. Mowing down Whitley's soldiers and mutated monsters alike, the player finally reaches the Colonel at the excavation site with the large alien spacecraft, where Whitley has transformed into a towering thing beast. With the help of a helicopter pilot with a very familiar hat, Blake takes down the malformed Colossus and escapes. The pilot reveals himself to be the missing R.J. MacReady. As the credits roll, the player is treated to the song After Me by Saliva. It's even teased on the box. The story here is serviceable, if not totally in line with the film upon which it's based. As an action game, the need to rely on big set pieces and an abundance of gunplay plant this more in the realm of bombastic Hollywood blockbusters than the understated mood piece that was the film. The story's twists and turns and an outright villain in the form of Colonel Whitley are far more conventional than Carpenter's paranoid descent into chaos. But it works for what it is. It wears its influences on its sleeve, taking significant cues from films like James Cameron's Aliens and other video games such as Half-Life. But perhaps some plot elements hew a little too close to their inspirations, namely the undeniable parallel between Whitley's cloud virus and Albert Wesker's involvement with the T-virus in the Resident Evil series. Much like the film, the game features very little music, but what does exist is extremely understated, mimicking the atmospheric synthesizer film score from Morricone. As a gameplay experience, The Thing succeeds in a number of ways, not only as a mechanically sound interactive narrative, but also as a resonant thematic extension of Carpenter's film and even Campbell's original story. The action is fast-paced and frenetic, offering two modes of gunplay: a less accurate shoot from the hip style that allows the player to keep moving, and a much more precise first-person aiming mode. The drawback here is that you cannot move while shooting. 3 controller configurations provide some options in how buttons are mapped. The default Type A locks the camera to Blake's back, putting forward, backward, and pivoting movements on the left joystick. I found Type C much more comfortable as it uses the left stick for forward, backward, and sidestepping maneuvers, while the right stick controls turning. This made the game feel more modern and intuitive. Not that I have nothing but praise for the controls. Unfortunately, there is no input setting that puts item and weapon switching on anything but the directional pad. And as this is a left thumb function, it becomes inconvenient to try to switch weapons or items while staying in motion. Some might argue that this adds to the tension intended in a survival horror game, like the unwieldy tank controls in early Resident Evil entries, but I found this to be more of a bug than a feature. Blake will encounter 4 main enemy types on this adventure. Scuttlers are small thing creatures formed from the appendages of a formerly living host, much like the head spider from the film. These are easily dispatched with regular gunfire. Larger monsters called walkers require a slightly different strategy, however. After weakening a walker with a regular weapon, only fire can finish them off, another callback to the movie. This can be delivered by one of a few flame-throwing weapons, or even an incendiary grenade. But be careful, because Blake is not impervious to fire, even if he's responsible for it in the first place. A quick squirt with the fire extinguisher will have the player safely traversing once again. Aside from enemy soldiers who pop up in the last half of the game to trade bullets with Blake and crew, the only other enemies are the bosses, which always take the form of huge beasts fixed in one part of a room, taking swipes at the player character. These fights are tough, but there's usually a sweet spot that allows for safe dispatching of the disgusting behemoths. The Thing boasts decent graphics for the time, featuring some neat lighting effects that invoke Cundy's marvelous cinematography. The cool blue ambiance plays in contrast to the bright pink flare items, a bit of color direction lifted directly from the film. The environments are nice and varied, providing a good mix of claustrophobic corridors and open spaces, including outdoor areas. Speaking of which, the exposure system is particularly interesting. Some levels require players to explore vast exteriors with a blue meter that continually depletes the longer you stay in the cold. Any kind of covering will cause the bar to refill, but too long in the raging wind and snow will soon have Blake's life meter falling until he succumbs to the harsh elements. Fortunately, squad members are not affected by the outdoors, but that doesn't mean the player should not stay vigilant of their team. Any accompanying NPC who comes in contact with a Thing creature stands a chance of becoming infected, so always be wary of those who withstand attacks. Blake's followers will also occasionally lose their nerve, causing them to freeze in place, fire their weapon erratically, or even take their own life. This can be triggered by anything from an intense battle, a gruesome scene of past violence, or spending too long in the dark. This can be remedied by leading the affected soldier out of the area or by injecting them with adrenaline. Non-player characters can take the form of 3 different classes. The soldier boasts the greatest weapon accuracy and resilience to fear. The medic has an infinite supply of medical kits and can heal the group when health gets low, and the engineer can repair electrical boxes and power panels, and are often required to get through a stage. In fact, if your engineer dies in battle, the player will usually be greeted with a mission failed screen, depending on the requirements of the stage. Your team can be summoned to follow or commanded to stay on a group or individual basis, allowing you to leave valuable members like the medic or engineer behind, keeping them safe from a particularly difficult enemy encounter. But by far the most interesting system in the game is based on trust between your squad mates. Often you'll encounter an NPC whom you'd like to follow you, but they refuse. And why wouldn't they? This is a world where no one is who they seem and monsters hide in the most unsuspecting of supposed allies. You can earn their trust in a number of ways, including saving them from an imminent threat, providing them with a weapon and ammunition, or by performing a blood test on yourself to prove you are human. Thankfully, like the exposure system, this isn't something you have to babysit as you work your way through the game, avoiding the pitfalls of the dreaded escort mission. In my playthrough, I found that once you win someone over, they more or less stay loyal to you. But if you find yourself in a tight spot and need to take someone's weapon, they may lose that trust. And if their meter falls too low, they may even attack. One part of the game even implements this as a sort of puzzle, where you find yourself without a weapon at all and surrounded by monsters. The only answer is to win the trust of a sole nearby NPC by giving him ammo and allowing him to protect you from enemies. Not to worry though, the squad members tend to have pretty good aim. Blake's followers will communicate their needs and conditions verbally, as well as through a plethora of overhead icons. There are so many of these indicators that it took me a while to understand the nuances of all their variations, but a quick look at the squad member screen will give you a better idea of what's going on with any given teammate. My biggest complaint with the squad mechanics is that none of the NPCs you encounter stay with you for more than 1 or 2 levels, often dying in an unpreventable accident or just mysteriously disappearing between stages without a word of explanation. In a game so focused, and more so successful, on the dynamics of trust between teammates, this feels like a missed opportunity to allow the player to perhaps grow close to a fellow soldier who may very well meet their demise at some point along the way, perhaps even at the hand of the player if necessary. The emotional impact of this could be a fascinating and unscripted element that gives each playthrough unique and unrepeatable consequences, and furthermore, a real sense of stakes. My second biggest complaint is that they can be really, really stupid and just stop following you for no discernible reason. I occasionally had to literally push my team around to get them into places I wanted them to go or to start following me again. That was irritating. The progress system is also unnecessarily frustrating. Save points are usually generously scattered around any given level, but upon the player character's death, no option to load from a save is available. The 2 options are to restart the level, which will frequently put the player far ahead of the most recent save point, or to return to the main menu, from which you can load your save. Maybe it's a nitpick, but returning to the main menu after a game over screen feels like an unnecessary step that only served to get on my nerves. Minor quibbles aside, I really enjoyed my time with The Thing. The campaign runs about 9 hours, give or take, feeling substantial enough to feel like a full experience without wearing out its welcome. Although not considered official canon, I find it interesting that we actually have a Thing trilogy of sorts since the release of the 2011 prequel film. My very brief thoughts on that movie amount to, it's fine. But if you're looking for something fun and unique from that world to supplement your enjoyment of Carpenter's film, or any of its previous iterations for that matter, look no further than The Thing video game. Its impressive ability to transplant what I consider the most important aspects of Carpenter's classic into a functional game mechanic make it one of the most notable movie tie-ins I've ever played, and not enough people talk about it. As of the making of this video, yet another version of Who Goes There has been announced as in development by Blumhouse Productions, and I've already seen the whining online. But allow me to remind you, without remakes, reboots, and adaptations, we wouldn't have many of the most treasured films and even video games that we have today, including John Carpenter's The Thing. Even if it fails to capture what you love about any and all previous versions, that doesn't diminish what already exists. And who knows? It could be the greatest adaptation of Campbell's story yet. And if it is, you'll know it when you see it.